Mr. President, the United Nations Security Council has, for half a year, 6 months, been unable to adopt a document with a demand for a ceasefire in Gaza. All of the attempts, time and again, came up against the resistance of the United States, who 4 times, in cold blood, cast a veto in this chamber. In this time, we have heard from U.S. colleagues repeatedly their justifications. Either they were saying that the achievement of a ceasefire is premature, insofar as there is a need to give space for so-called counterterrorism efforts of Israel, or they demanded for the Security Council not to stand in the way of effective diplomacy of Washington on the ground. That is a quote. Or they called for us to wait for the onset of Ramadan, when apparently an agreement would definitely be reached for a ceasefire, for an end to the violence. And now, 6 months have elapsed. Gaza has virtually been wiped from the earth, and now the U.S. representative, without blinking, has been asserting that Washington has finally begun to recognize the need for a ceasefire. This sluggish thought process in Washington has come at the cost of the lives of 32,000 peaceful Palestinians, 2/3 of whom are women and children. And even now we have observed a typical hypocritical spectacle when, wrapped up in a ceasefire, the United States have been trying to sell a product to the membership of the Security Council and to the entire international community. They've been trying to sell something completely different, namely a diluted formulation about a definition and determination of the imperative for a ceasefire. This kind of philosophical passages about moral imperatives are seen in limited quantities in the work of Immanuel Kant. However, to save the lives of peaceful Palestinian civilians, this is not enough. And this is in no way what is stipulated in the mandate of the UN Security Council, the council which is vested with a unique mechanism to demand a ceasefire and, where necessary, to compel compliance therewith. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, during an official interview in Jeddah on the 20th of March with the correspondent Al-Haddad, stated, and I quote, "Well, in fact, we actually have a resolution that we put forward right now that's before the UN Security Council that does call for an immediate ceasefire tied to the release of hostages, and we hope very much that countries will support that." End quote. However, in the text of the U.S. draft, which has been put to the vote today, there is no such call. So what turns out is that either the U.S. representative at the United Nations or the U.S. Secretary of State have been deliberately misleading the international community. Distinguished colleagues, from the very onset, it was clear that the so-called negotiations which our U.S. colleagues have been engaged in on this issue have been focused merely to drag out the time. All of our comments, all of our red lines were time and time disregarded, as were the proposals of a number of other delegations. This was some kind of an empty rhetorical exercise rather than normal work on a document. The American product is exceedingly politicized, the sole purpose of which is to help to play to the voters, to throw them a bone in the form of some kind of a mention of a ceasefire in Gaza, and to establish the U.S.'s political ambitions in the region through the establishment of terrorist labels, and to ensure the impunity of Israel, whose crimes in the draft are not even assessed. I wish to draw attention to the following. The U.S. draft contains an effective green light for Israel to mount a military operation in Rafah. At the very least, the authors try to make it such that nothing would prevent Western Jerusalem from continuing their brutal cleansing of the south of the Gaza Strip. And what is Washington actually trying to achieve? We have already stated that we will no longer tolerate pointless resolutions which do not contain a call for a ceasefire, which lead us to nowhere. This draft should not pass with the majority of the membership to send a message about the inadmissibility, not the palliative, but the actual intentions of Washington. It would be very strange for us to see those members of the Council, of whom there are a majority, who understand this and who persuaded us of the deficiencies in the U.S. draft. We'd be surprised if they now lift their hands voting in favor of it. Ladies and gentlemen, if you do this, you will cover yourselves in disgrace. Consider once again, how will you look before the population of the Middle East, in front of your own populations, if you support this hypocritical initiative, which is designed to disorient the international community and essentially to undermine the authority of the Council, making sure that it cannot have an impact on the situation on the ground, that this Council will not be able to have an impact of the situation on the ground, to ensure that it not get in the way of the White House? Are you willing to play into their hands when it comes to this unsavory spectacle? The Russian Federation will not do this. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, as one of the founders of the United Nations, we recognize the historical global responsibility we shoulder for the maintenance of international peace and security. We cannot allow the Security Council to become an instrument in the advancement of Washington's destructive policy in the Middle East. If this resolution is to be adopted, this would definitively close the door when it comes to discussions about the need for a ceasefire in Gaza. This would free the hands of Israel, and it would result in all of Gaza, its entire population, having to face destruction, devastation, or expulsion. We are not guided by what is convenient for Washington and satellites, the satellites who raise their hands following instructions from Washington. We do not follow this. What guides us is what is necessary for the Palestinian people and what helps to advance peace. We call upon the membership of the Security Council not to allow this to occur, to vote against the U.S. draft. Mr. President, for the United Nations Security Council to ultimately be in a position to deliver upon its mandate for the maintenance of international peace and security, a number of non-permanent members of the Security Council have drafted an alternative draft resolution which stipulates black on white the demand for both a ceasefire and the unconditional release of hostages. This is a balanced and an apolitical document. We see no reason for which the membership of the Security Council, for the members of the Security Council not to support this, unless a ceasefire and the release of hostages is not part of their plans. This is an attempt to allow the Council to comply with the noble functions that have been vested in it. And I